Okay, I think it's okay to begin and say hi. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so my name's Hayley. I'm an educational psychologist working in Warwickshire for Warwickshire County Council. And today I've brought some information to share about self-determination theory, which links to my doctoral thesis. So I finished my doctorate last summer and started as an EP in September. I'm just going to share my screen now, and we can all see the topic of the session today. Hopefully that's in view for everybody. Hopefully someone will also let me know if it's not before I carry on. Okay, all sharing, all good. Okay, so as I mentioned briefly, I looked at, for my doctoral thesis, I was looking at self-determination theory and its application within schools and supporting teachers. It was looking at taking a systemic approach to supporting motivation and linking that with behaviour in schools. And the reason the systemic approach refers to the nature of self-determination theory being a systemic theory of motivation, but also the teacher training aspect of the research project that I did. So what I'm hoping that we'll cover today, and the aims of the session, is to introduce a little briefly, really, what is motivation, and linking to that theory that I've mentioned, self-determination theory, and what that theory is a little bit more about. I'd hope then to talk a little bit about my research, so thinking about what was driving my research and the design that I ended up with, some of the key findings of that. So my research, as I mentioned, was looking at developing and delivering a training package for secondary teachers, supporting their understanding and skills around self-determination theory and how we apply that in schools. And then kind of moving towards the end of the session today, thinking about what the findings were and the conclusions around that, and what the implications might be. So for professionals working in schools, working with children and young people, working to support school staff, what can we kind of take forward from that, and from this area of this psychological area really as well in the whole. Okay, so what is motivation? As the information on the slide, I mean, people are obviously welcome to read the information on the slide, pretty much explains it, but motivation is really the process, the force that drives us towards our, to act, that drives us towards making choices, guides our behaviour, takes us towards our goals. It's what causes us to act. So, examples here, whether it be to get a glass of water because we're thirsty, or to read a book because we have a particular area of knowledge that we'd like to further. This is what motivation is doing. It's people describe it as a biological, emotional, social, and cognitive force that activates or motivates or drives behaviour. So often the term motivation is used to describe why a person might do something. So it's that driving force behind our actions, and it's the essence of really kind of energizing us towards our goals, towards achieving something. When we're motivated, we move and we take action towards something. And in terms of different types of motivation, whilst it's not necessarily clearly discrete categories, and there is a bit of a continuum that you can learn a bit more about in terms of different kinds of external or extrinsic motivation. Often motivation gets classified into whether it's external, so extrinsic or external motivation, or whether it's internal or intrinsic motivation. So in terms of external or externally motivated behaviour, that is behaviour that's driven in order to receive a reward or to get some kind of benefit, get some kind of incentive around that behaviour. Equally, it might be externally motivated if it's if it's an activity is engaged in to avoid something, to avoid a threat, to avoid a negative consequence, some kind of punishment, or that kind of thing. So something external to us is influencing and shaping our behaviour, whether we're aiming towards something positive and something rewarding, or we're aiming to avoid something negative and something more kind of like a consequence. And we perceive these behaviours to be outside of us, so that kind of external locus of control, locus of causality. Whereas intrinsic or internally motivated behaviour is behaviour that's done without that sense of pressure from an external source to gain something or to avoid something. The activity is engaged in because we want to, we enjoy it, it's rewarding, it's meaningful for us. Might not necessarily be exciting, or it might be that it aligns with our values, that we engage with it because we know it helps us to achieve a bigger goal. So it has some kind of purpose or value for us to engage in that behaviour. And we perceive that then as a kind of locus of causality. We perceive that from coming from within ourselves rather than from some external source. And as I'll mention as well later on, we know that intrinsic motivation, thinking about going back to our roles with children and young people and working in schools, we know that intrinsic motivation from the research is associated with enhanced student learning, better psychological and emotional well-being, social and emotional adjustment. There's so many different positive benefits associated with intrinsic motivation. So understanding it and how we can facilitate intrinsic motivation is really important in our roles. Self-determination theory, so the theory that is underpinning my research and underpinning this session today, really. There are lots of theories, psychological theories of motivation. We could talk about different ones. You may have heard of expectancy value theory, attribution theory, self-efficacy theory. But some of those other theories, what I found or what I felt was that they attribute motivation, they place the ownership of that within the person's own cognitions, their own affective states. Whereas self-determination theory, as I said right at the start, thinking about it being a systemic theory, what self-determination theory does is it considers the environment around a person. So the extent to which the environment supports and encourages motivation and fulfills these three core psychological needs. So self-determination theory suggests that we're all, as humans, it's a theory of human motivation. It applies equally to us as it does to students in school or whatever, but it suggests that we're all naturally active and engaged with the world, curious to learn, interested to find out more, to develop ourselves, to work towards our kind of own personal growth. And so we're all naturally inclined to do that is what the theory suggests. The way in which we develop our intrinsic motivation, so that motivation that comes from within us, self-determination theory would suggest that in order to have that intrinsic motivation, the environment around us needs to support these three core psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So we fulfill those three, well, the environment helps us to fulfill those needs, we feel we get that sense of intrinsic motivation. Thinking of it, autonomy, you've got that sense of having control, having ownership in the way that your life goes, feeling that you have choices over decisions that affect you, feeling that you've got some kind of say in what happens and ownership over the course of your life. Then you've got competence, and what competence is that sense of feeling able, feeling effective, feeling as though you've got the skills and ability that you need to achieve the task at hand. And it may be that you're supported, there may be structures around you or people around you or supports around you that help you. But essentially with all those in place, you feel able and effective and competent to achieve. And in terms of relatedness, as social beings, we're all naturally inclined to desire that social connection, to feel that sense of closeness with others, to have those strong, trusting relationships with people, to get that sense of belonging and to feel like we value and that we are part of a group. So that's our sense of relatedness. In the classroom context, the students, young people that have greater need satisfaction, so where those three needs are more greatly kind of met, they're more likely to have higher levels of intrinsic motivation. They're more likely to be more willing to engage, even in those less interesting tasks, but they do have that kind of high academic value. They may feel that they've got maybe more choice, they maybe feel more confident, and likely experience greater sense of wellness and value, kind of have that higher level of value of what school can offer them, really. But there is the problem then of when these needs aren't met. So self-determination theory, as I said, suggests that the environment plays a big part in whether the needs are met or satisfied, or whether the needs are not met. And it's the environment, and it's the adults, and it's the people around. So thinking about it from a school perspective, it's the school environment and the adults around the students that can impact on whether these needs are met and satisfied. So self-determination theory suggests three different need states, and they are need satisfaction, need dissatisfaction, and need frustration. So with need satisfaction, the needs, those three core psychological needs are being met, and there's adaptive functioning related to that. So you have motivated behaviour, energized, you have students that might appear focused, interested, ready for learning. That's your adaptive functioning within a school context. But the other two need states are where the needs aren't met. Need dissatisfaction and need frustration both result in maladaptive functioning, but they might look slightly differently. So what the research suggests is that need dissatisfaction is where your needs are neglected or not really considered, or other people's needs are placed, in a greater priority than your own. And that can result in behaviour, the research says, in behaviour that looks a little bit like disengaged and amotivated, passive, and bored. Whereas need frustration links to having, relates to where needs are actively suppressed, overridden. This might include the use of control or pressure inducing approaches. And this can result in behaviour that might look a little bit more antisocial or oppositional, maybe a little bit more aggressive or defiant, in terms of what that might look like. And then again, because the school context and the adults around the students are so important in terms of supporting those three core psychological needs, research also suggests that adults around the students can take one of three, not all the time, sometimes you might fluctuate between the three, but one of these three different motivating styles. So to have a need supportive style, that might be where you're showing concern and empathy, perspective taking, giving the students that sense of choice, and inviting their initiatives, and that kind of non-controlling language might be coming in there. Where needs are neglected or ignored, put aside, maybe the need indifferent style is not really paying attention to the needs, and they're kind of neglected a little bit there. And then the need thwarting style might include a little bit more of a sense of pressure and control. It might be using pressure and control to kind of insist on compliance, that kind of authoritarian position of, you need to do this, else there'll be some kind of consequence for you. It's the need indifferent and need thwarting motivating styles that I said to kind of activate that negative maladaptive functioning that I talked about previously, whereas the need supportive style to help to create that more adaptive functioning for the students that we work with. So that's kind of makes that important as a means of supporting students to be within that adaptive functioning, if we can employ that sense of a need supportive style when we're working with children and young people. So my research, I was interested in how schools approach what they might consider to be challenging behaviour. I was aware of the research, that's obviously research suggesting that there is a negative impact when there's challenging or disruptive behaviour in schools, negative impact for the student themselves, negative impact on the teachers and their well-being. So I'm aware that is the case. However, the approaches that often get used more come from a behaviourist approach of rewards and consequences. They may be more punitive in nature, and the research does suggest that there is this association between a punitive disciplinary style and that kind of link with increasing exclusions, and what has been coined the school to prison pipeline. So I was quite interested in that use of a more punitive approach to discipline, a more authoritarian approach to discipline, and actually the evidence doesn't support its effectiveness. There's evidence that it doesn't improve academic attainment, behaviour safety, school climate, loads of different outcomes. The authoritarian or punitive approach doesn't seem to lend support on those outcome measures. And there's suggestion that it increases defiance as well. Or it might increase defiance, it might increase antisocial behaviour. There's a really recent meta-analysis from last year, 2021, by Donald and colleagues. And this wasn't just about students or young people, but what that research found was that there's increasing controlling behaviour was associated with increased antisociality. So you see that link, that actually it's not necessarily helpful, can actually be counterproductive. And those approaches to behaviour management also locate the problem, I say the problem in inverted commas, they locate that within the student. So it doesn't therefore allow that account to be made for the environmental factors, what's going on around the student, what is the impact of the style of the adults interacting with them. It doesn't allow really for that consideration. We know from the literature that there is an association between especially intrinsic motivation and behaviour. So as I've mentioned, all those kind of outcomes from before, but intrinsic motivation is associated with greater psychological well-being, reduced rates of dropout, greater engagement with school, greater academic success. But conversely, low levels of intrinsic motivation have been associated with disengagement and other problematic student behaviour. And there has been an identified dip when they look at intrinsic motivation levels in students. This dip tends to happen around the age of 13, that kind of adolescence, secondary phase of education. So it might be that it's something to do, that might suggest it's something to do with adolescence itself. It might be something to do with, changes that are associated with puberty, brain development at that stage of life. Alternatively, or additionally even, that decline in intrinsic motivation might be related more to how motivational a secondary environment is. So kind of linking to my rationale for the study was that we could see that from the research that if we foster the three core needs, we are able to promote higher engagement and motivation in students and decrease that sense of need dissatisfaction and need frustration that are associated with those maladaptive student behaviours. If we can support teachers' ability, therefore, to provide that need supportive teaching style, we can hopefully increase student motivation, achievement behaviour, etc. So therefore, it's kind of an important area to study. Is this impactful for helping teachers really to adopt a need supportive teaching style? The study focused on secondary teachers, and one of the reasons for that, as I just mentioned, there is that decline in intrinsic motivation in the around adolescence. So linking into that, you've got secondary teachers that are able to hopefully buffer the impact of that by providing a more motivational environment for students. And there is quite a lot of research in this area, but there were some key gaps. So I was hoping that my research might plug some of those key gaps. So for example, a lot of the research in self-determination theory focuses on engagement in sport and PE and other physical activities. So my study was looking more widely at just engagement, classroom engagement. A lot of the research in this area picks up upon autonomy strategies or competency supporting strategies. But what I wanted to do was give teachers a grounding in all three of the core psychological needs and provide strategies around all three. Also, a lot of the research does look at teachers in training, so that the pre-service teachers. And what my research wanted to do was to broaden that out, to think about teachers already in service as that part of their professional development. So the design of the study was the design and delivery of online self-determination theory-based training for secondary teachers. I had 33 secondary teachers join the training across different events, and there were teachers across England and Wales, as it was an online, became an online piece of training with the COVID lockdowns, went from being in face-to-face to an online version. So I was able to access participants from different places. So I had 33 secondary teachers join. I designed the training to be in two parts. So there was a theoretical content section, and a few days later, there was a practical strategies part. So the theoretical content was a bit about self-determination theory, the difficulties of unmet needs, the link between behaviour and motivation. And the practical strategies, picking up on the three core psychological needs, and looking at the other research in the area as to what practical strategies we could kind of distill and share with teachers to use in their practice. And they also had a reflection activity between those two parts. What I was doing with that is I encouraged the teachers to reflect on how we could use self-determination theory, linking specifically to the pandemic. So when schools were to resume, how could we think about SDT in that context, and how we could re-engage students with school after COVID lockdown kind of eased a little bit. As the design changed a little bit because of the nature of the pandemic, I then decided to create more of a mixed methods approach. So I had some quantitative research questions and a qualitative research question that kind of supplemented, but was slightly had a different focus. So my quantitative research questions, what I was using quantitative data to do was to think about whether there was an impact of the training. So following participation in the training, was there an increase in teachers' senses of self-efficacy, their sense of responsibility, and their teacher control beliefs, so those moderate and low teacher control beliefs? And also, was there a decrease in high teacher control beliefs or negative attitudes towards challenging behaviour? And then the qualitative element of the study, which involved some written textual answers to that reflection activity that I just mentioned. So teachers were asked to reflect on how they could use self-determination theory to support students to re-engage. So that was what I was looking at, the factors that the teachers perceived to be important around that. So briefly, very, very briefly, and obviously bearing in mind the research limitations, the design limitations meant we couldn't, I wasn't able to assert causality really, but there were some shifts noted in teachers' attitudes and beliefs. So there was increased self-efficacy for student engagement and classroom management was noted, increased sense of personal responsibility, and that was especially for personal responsibility for student motivation. Also, there was some reduced high teacher control beliefs, so reduced authoritarian beliefs and reduced negative emotions and negative immediate reactions to challenging behaviour. So there was those shifts in attitudes and beliefs that I thought was really interesting. In terms of the qualitative data, teachers were able to apply self-determination theory to consider how to re-engage students. They took that on really well, and they were strong advocates for a relational approach, for need-supportive approaches to support students. And they really emphasised that we needed to put psychological needs first over and above any academic curriculum pressures. They really did emphasise the importance of prioritising students' psychological needs. So I kind of drew a few conclusions from what I found, in that the participation in the training, the SDT based intervention, it was associated with changes in teachers' beliefs. So it's tentative associations because, as I said before, we couldn't necessarily determine exactly the causality, but the associations nonetheless were there. And it was especially noticeable, thinking about what teachers thought about their responsibility for supporting motivation, what their beliefs were about teacher control, and what their feelings were about negative behavior, challenging behavior, whether that soften some of those negative feelings about that. So the SDT based training could have supported teachers to actually reflect on the environment around the student and the impact of the environment and the impact of a motivational style on not just students' motivation, but then consequently possible behaviour. So giving some training that's underpinned by that systemic theory of motivation might have helped there to shift some of those thoughts and beliefs. And the teachers did endorse relational approaches, and they prioritised psychological needs, and that's really important when we're working with teachers, because it's where their values lie. It's kind of they want to do that. They want to support students in that way. The teachers in this study strongly advocated that they wanted to do that. There was some doubt about how feasible, how practical, and the barriers to that. There was some doubt around the barriers to prioritising psychological needs in the current educational climate, but nonetheless that was what they advocated. And I concluded that self-determination theory is a valuable theoretical framework that we can use when we're considering our work in schools to support engagement and motivation in the classroom. So what then does that mean for practitioners going into schools, working with students, working with school staff? What are the implications for professionals in this area? You could draw a range of implications here. One of the things that stood out for me was the importance of reframing, changing the narrative really around behaviour. So providing that sense of reframe that the behaviour being within child's situation that actually might be a consequence of unmet needs, might be a consequence of an environment that's not proactively supporting motivation through the motivational styles of the adults, for example. So we can encourage, when we're working with schools and working with school staff, perhaps we can talk about and we can share that information about self-determination theory and what that means, and the links between motivation and behaviour, and the link between unmet needs and behaviour. And we can maybe help give school staff some time and space to reflect on that, and to think, how can they apply that knowledge in their class practices? How can they apply that knowledge in their when they're talking and interacting on a one-to-one level with a student? How can schools take this further and apply it in school-wide approaches? In our roles going into schools and a kind of consulting capacity, can we support adults in schools and school as a whole to promote the importance of taking that need supportive approach? If we're sharing the knowledge that we've taken from research, evidence-based strategies, if we can share them on with school staff, strategies that have been found to increase and enhance intrinsic motivation and engagement, we can be that kind of link between research and evidence to bring in those strategies and make them applicable into schools. And we can promote this particular bullet point here, promote the use of relational approaches. That kind of ties in specifically to relatedness, supporting that connection and that sense of belonging. We can promote that through policy changes. You might be familiar with some of the attachment aware policies out there, like the Brighton and Hove policy. There's a Babcock Devon policy as well that's important to have a read of if you haven't, looking at developing relational practices in schools. So we can support with that. We can support with professional development initiatives for training, for coaching, for school staff. And we can use our skills to evaluate the impact of that, whether bringing in these motivationally supportive interventions and approaches has the impact that we would like. So I think we'll be able to share this on a bigger, this is a bit small, I appreciate. So there's a handout that hopefully I'll be able to share on with people that are interested to have a look. I developed a handout that pulled together the strategies that can be useful for supporting autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So the kind of practical strategies that we can share with schools, we can share with adults in schools. So there's a guide that I've created that I've taken this image from, that hopefully you'd be able to have access to if you would like. So for example, with autonomy supporting strategies, you know, some of those ideas might be around providing explanations and rationales, using informational rather than controlling language, showing patience and understanding for perspectives. That would all be autonomy supportive. For competence supporting strategies, it's around clear expectations, structure, guidance and scaffolding, and feedback. They're kind of key elements to support competence there. And relatedness, you know, it's looking at, there are evidence-based strategies that are really quick and simple that you can share with schools. For example, you've got acknowledging everybody by name at the door is an evidence-based strategy. The 5-to-1 praise to criticism ratio, that's another evidence-based strategy that is so, you know, simple and easy to implement really. But there's some other relational strategies down the side there as well. Some other research that I've recently had my attention drawn to is this research by Ahmadi et al. In 2022. So it's really new. I don't even think it's been properly published yet. But this is an excerpt. So this table here is an excerpt from their paper. And what they did was they classified a whole series of different motivational behaviours. Well, some behaviours are motivational, some motivationally supportive, some behaviours were motivationally thwarting. They grouped them in terms of autonomy supportive or thwarting behaviours, competence, and so on, and relatedness. And they then ranked them in terms of how impactful the behaviours were. So you can see the column down the right-hand side, which says effect on motivation. So they've ranked them in terms of the most impactful behaviours, so the ones that are going to have the most effect on motivation. So that's worth a look, that paper. So this table here just it shows you some examples of the teacher behaviours and what that might look like as an example in real life. So that's autonomy supporting, and then you've got competence supporting there, and you've got relatedness supporting there. So that's a paper there. The reference is underneath. So a classification system for teachers' motivational behaviours recommended in self-determination theory interventions. It's worth a little look, especially for the table. I think it's really quite useful as a way of distilling the evidence of what works to, in terms of bringing self-determination theory in as practical application, what works, what's most effective to share with schools and school staff. That's the end of the presentation today. I hope it was interesting. I hope it's given some food for thought. I think we can have a few questions now. If I have a look at the box. Okay, so yeah, so let's have a little look. The questions around the practical strategies, thank you for the question around that. Hopefully that's been answered. The question about how teachers were selected, they were self-selecting, which does bring its own limitations in terms of whether they were already of a mindset that was conducive to learning about motivation. They didn't have much prior training in the area. I did ask them that. And what I hoped for was to provide that sense of autonomy to self-select. So it wasn't a controlled motivation to attend the training. It was an autonomous decision. Okay. The question around resistance, because there may be, if you were to try and implement this, the teachers that came along were individual teachers that were interested and wanted to take their learning further. So if you were to try and embed this as a whole school strategy and approach, it might, you never know, encounter some resistance. Okay. Control. Yeah, so the strategies, I'm not sure exactly how they'll be shared. Hopefully there'll be a Google document that you can access on that one. Okay. I think that's everything. The time, are we okay for time? So I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for coming along. Hoping it was useful, and hopefully you'll receive additional information, or you'll be able to access the additional information in there. I will put I did put some references for further reading and things like that. Okay, thank you.